Thrift by Samuel Smiles. Healthy Homes Part 2. Edwin Chadwick has not yet received ordinary justice from his contemporaries, though he has been one of the most indefatigable and successful workers of the age and has greatly influenced the legislation of his time. He is probably less known than many a fourth-rate parliamentary talker. Mr. Chadwick belongs to a Lancashire family and was born near Manchester. He received his education chiefly in London. Having chosen the law for his profession, he was enrolled a student of the Inner Temple in his 26th year. There he ate his way to the bar, maintaining himself by reporting and writing for the daily press. He was not a man of an extraordinary amount of learning, but he was a sagacious and persevering man. He was ready to confront any amount of labor in prosecuting an object, no matter how remote its attainment might at first sight appear to be. At an early period in his career, Edwin Chadwick became possessed by an idea. It is a great thing to be thoroughly possessed by an idea, provided its aim and end be beneficent. It gives a color and bias to the whole of a man's life. The idea was not a new one, but being taken up by an earnest, energetic, and hard-working man, there was some hope for the practical working out of his idea in the actual life of humanity. It was neither more nor less than the sanitary idea, the germ of the sanitary movement. We must now briefly state how he worked his way to its practical realization. It appears that Mr. Morgan, the government actuary, had stated before a parliamentary committee that though the circumstances of the middle classes had improved, their expectation of life had not lengthened. This being diametrically opposed to our student's idea, he endeavored to demonstrate the fallacy of the actuary's opinion. He read up and sifted numerous statistical documents, blue books, life tables, and population tables. He bored his way through the cumbrous pile and brought an accumulation of facts from the most unlooked-for quarters for the purpose of illustrating his idea and elucidating his master thought. The result was published in the Westminster Review for April 1828. Mr. Chadwick demonstrated by an immense array of facts and arguments that the circumstances which surround human beings must have an influence upon their health, that health must improve with an improvement of these circumstances, that many of the diseases and conditions unfavorable to human life were under man's control and capable of being removed, that the practice of vaccination, the diminution of hard drinking amongst the middle and upper classes, the increase of habits of cleanliness, the improvements in medical science, and the better construction of streets and houses must, according to all medical and popular experience, have contributed a priori to lengthen life, and these he proved by a citation of facts from numerous authentic sources. In short, Mr. Morgan was wrong. The expectancy of life, as is now universally admitted, has improved and is rapidly improving amongst the better classes, but it was never thoroughly demonstrated until Edwin Chadwick undertook the discussion of the question. Another article, which Mr. Chadwick published in the London Review in 1829 on preventive police, was read by Jeremy Bentham, then in his 82nd year, who so much admired it that he craved an introduction to the writer. The consequence was the formation of a friendship that lasted without interruption until the death of the philosopher in 1832. Mr. Bentham wished to engage the whole of his young friend's time in assisting him with the preparation of his administrative code, and he offered to place him in independent circumstances if he would devote himself exclusively to the advancement of his views. The offer was, however, declined. Mr. Chadwick completed his law studies and was called to the bar in November 1830. He was preparing to enter upon the practice of common law, occasionally contributing articles to the Westminster, when he was, in 1832, appointed a commissioner, in conjunction with Dr. Southwood Smith and Mr. Tooke, to investigate the question of factory labour, which Lord Ashley and Mr. Sadler were at that time strongly pressing upon public attention. The sanitary idea again found opportunity for expression in the report of the Commission, which referred to defective drainage, ventilation, water supply, and the like as causes of disease, acting concurrently with excessive toil to depress the health and shorten the lives of the factory population. In the same year, 1832, an important commission of inquiry was appointed by Lord Grey's government in reference to the operation of the Poor Laws in England and Wales. Mr. Chadwick was appointed one of the assistant commissioners for the purpose of taking evidence on the subject, and the districts of London and Berkshire were allotted to him. His report, published in the following year, was a model of what a report should be. It was full of information, admirably classified and arranged, and was so racy by virtue of the facts brought to light and the care taken to preserve the very words of the witnesses as they were spoken, that the report may be read with interest by the most inveterate enemy of blue books. Mr. Chadwick showed himself so thoroughly a master of the subject, his suggestions were so full of practical value, that he was, shortly after the publication of the report, advanced from the post of Assistant Commissioner to that of Chief Commissioner, and he largely shared, with Mr. Senior, in the labours and honours of the Commissioner's report submitted to the House of Commons in 1834, and also in the famous Poor Law Amendment Act passed in the same year, in which the recommendations of the Commissioners were substantially adopted and formalized. One may venture to say now, without fear of contradiction, that law was one of the most valuable that has been placed on the statute book in modern times. And yet no law proved more unpopular than this was, for years after it had been enacted. But Mr. Chadwick never ceased to have perfect faith in the soundness of the principles on which it was based, and he was indefatigable in defending and establishing it. It has been well said that to become popular is an easy thing, but to do unpopular justice, that requires a man. And Edwin Chadwick is the man who has never failed in courage to do the right thing, even though it should prove to be the unpopular thing. Whilst borrowing amidst the voluminous evidence on the poor laws, Mr. Chadwick never lost sight of his sanitary idea. All his reports were strongly imbued with it. One force of the then existing pauperism was traced by him to the preventable causes of disease. His minute investigations into the condition of the labouring population and of the poorer classes generally gave him a thorough acquaintance with the physical evils that were preying upon the community, carrying them off by fevers, consumption, and cholera. And the sanitary idea took still firmer possession of his mind. One day, In 1838, while engaged in his official vocation of secretary to the Poor Law Commission, an officer of the Whitechapel Union hastily entered the boardroom of the Poor Law Commission and, with a troubled countenance, informed the secretary that a terrible fever had broken out round a stagnant pool in Whitechapel, that the people were dying by scores, and that the extreme malignity of the cases gave reason to apprehend that the disease was allied to Asiatic cholera. On hearing this, the board, at Mr. Chadwick's instance, immediately appointed Doctors Arnott, Kay, and Southwood Smith to investigate the causes of this alarming mortality and to report generally upon the sanitary condition of London. This inquiry at length ripened into the sanitary inquiry. In the meantime, Mr. Chadwick had been engaged as a member of the commission to inquire as to the best means of establishing an efficient constabulary force in England and Wales. The evidence was embodied in a report as interesting as a novel of Dickens, which afforded a curious insight into the modes of living, the customs and habits of the lowest classes of the population. When this question had been dismissed, Mr. Chadwick proceeded to devote himself almost exclusively to the great work of his life, the sanitary movement. The Bishop of London, in 1839, moved in the Lords that the inquiry which had been made at Mr. Chadwick's instance by Doctors Southwood Smith, Arnott, and Kay into the sanitary state of the metropolis should be extended to the whole population, city, rural, and manufacturing, of England and Wales. Some residents in Edinburgh also petitioned that Scotland might be included, and accordingly, in August 1839, Lord John Russell addressed a letter to the Poor Law Board, authorizing them by royal command to extend to the whole of Great Britain the inquiry into preventable disease, which had already been begun with regard to the metropolis. The onerous task of setting on foot and superintending the inquiry throughout, of sifting the evidence and classifying and condensing it for the purposes of publication, devolved upon Mr. Chadwick. The first report on the health of towns was ready for publication in 1842. It ought to have appeared as the official report of the Poor Law Board, but as the commissioners, some of whom were at variance with Mr. Chadwick with respect to the new Poor Law, refused to assume the responsibility of a document that contained much that must necessarily offend many influential public bodies, Mr. Chadwick took the responsibility upon himself, and it was published as his report, which indeed it was, and accepted from him as such by the commissioners. The amount of dry, hard work encountered by Mr. Chadwick in the preparation of this and his other reports can scarcely be estimated, except by those who know anything of the labor involved in extracting from masses of evidence, written and printed, sent in from all parts of the empire, only the most striking results bearing upon the question in hand, and such as are deemed worthy of publication. The mountains of paper which Mr. Chadwick has thus bored through in his lifetime must have been immense, and could they now be presented before him in one pile, they would appall even his stout heart. The sensation excited throughout the country by the publication of Mr. Chadwick's sanitary report was immense. Such a revelation of the horrors lying concealed beneath the fair surface of our modern civilization had never before been published. But Mr. Chadwick had no idea of merely creating a sensation. He had an object in view, which he persistently pursued. The report was nothing unless its recommendations were speedily carried into effect. A sanitary party was formed, and the ministers, for the time being, aided by members of both sides in politics, became its influential leaders. A sanitary commission was appointed in 1844 to consider the whole question in its practical bearings. The commission published 2 reports with a view to legislation, but the free trade struggle interfered, and little was done for several years. Meanwhile, our sanitary reformer was occupied as a commissioner in inquiring into the condition of the metropolis. The commission published 3 reports in which the defective drainage, sewage and water supply of London were discussed in detail, and these have recently been followed by important acts of legislation. The sanitary idea at length had its triumph in the enactment of the Public Health Act of 1848 and the appointment of a General Board of Health, of which Mr. Chadwick was a member, to superintend its administration. Numerous supplemental measures have since been enacted, with the view of carrying into practical effect the sanitary principles adopted by the board. Reports continue to be published from time to time, full of valuable information, for instance, in reference to the application of sewage water to agricultural purposes, on epidemic cholera, on quarantine, on drainage, on public lodging houses, and the like. The sanitary movement, in short, became a great fact, and that it is so, we have mainly to thank Edwin Chadwick, the missionary of the sanitary idea. It is true, he was eventually dismissed from his position of influence at the Board of Health, partly through spleen, but chiefly because of his own unaccommodating nature. Unaccommodating especially to petty local authorities and individual interests opposed to the public good. But with all thinking and impartial men, his character stands as high as it ever did. At all events, his works remain. We do not know a more striking instance than that presented by this gentleman's career of the large amount of good which a man strongly possessed by a beneficent idea can accomplish, provided he have only the force of purpose and perseverance to follow it up. Though Mr. Chadwick has not been an actual legislator, he has nevertheless been the mover of more wise measures than any legislator of our time. He created a public opinion in favor of sanitary reform. He has also impressed the minds of benevolent individuals with the necessity for providing improved dwellings for the people, and has thus been the indirect means of establishing the Peabody dwellings, the Baroness Coots dwellings, and the various societies for erecting improved dwellings for the industrial classes. Edwin Chadwick has thus proved himself to be one of the most useful and practical of public benefactors. He deserves to be ranked with Clarkson or Howard. His labours have been equally salutary. Some will say that they have been much more so in their results. Sanitary science may be summed up in the one word: cleanliness. Pure water and pure air are its essentials. Wherever there is impurity, it must be washed away and got rid of. Thus, sanitary science is one of the simplest and most intelligible of all the branches of human knowledge. Perhaps it is because of this that, like most common things, it has continued to receive so little attention. Many still think that it requires no science at all to ventilate a chamber, to clean out a drain, and to keep house and person free from uncleanness. Sanitary science may be regarded as an unsavory subject. It deals with dirt and its expulsion from the skin, from the house, from the street, from the city. It is comprised in the words, wherever there is dirt, get rid of it instantly. And with cleanliness let there be a copious supply of pure water and of pure air for the purposes of human health. Take, for instance, an unhealthy street or block of streets in a large town. There you find typhus fever constantly present. Cleanse and sewer the street. Supply it with pure air and pure water, and fever is forthwith banished. Is not this a much more satisfactory result than the application of drugs? 50,000 persons, says Mr. Lee, annually fall victims to typhus fever in Great Britain, originated by causes which are preventable. The result is the same as if these 50,000 persons were annually taken out of their wretched dwellings and put to death. We are shocked by the news of a murder, by the loss of a single life by physical causes, and yet we hear, almost without a shudder, the reiterated statement of the loss of tens of thousands of lives yearly from physical causes in daily operation. The annual slaughter from preventable causes of typhus fever is double the amount of what was suffered by the Allied armies at the Battle of Waterloo. By neglect of the ascertained conditions of healthful living, the great mass of the people lose nearly half the natural period of their lives. Typhus, says a medical officer, is a curse which man inflicts upon himself by the neglect of sanitary arrangements. Mr. Chadwick affirmed that in the cellars of Liverpool, Manchester, and Leeds he had seen amongst the operatives more vice, misery, and degradation than those which, when detailed by Howard, had excited the sympathy of the world. The Irish poor sink into the unhealthy closes, lanes, and back streets of large towns, and so frequent are the attacks of typhus among them, that in some parts of the country the disease is known as the Irish fever. It is not merely the loss of life that is so frightful, there is also the moral death that is still more appalling in these unhealthy localities. Vice and crime consort with foul living. In these places demoralization is a normal state. There is an absence of cleanliness, of decency, of decorum. The language used is polluting, and scenes of profligacy are of almost hourly occurrence, all tending to foster idleness, drunkenness, and vicious abandonment. Imagine such a moral atmosphere for women and children. The connection is close and intimate between physical and moral health, between domestic well-being and public happiness. The destructive influence of an unwholesome dwelling propagates a moral typhus worse than the plague itself, where the body is enfeebled by the depressing influences of vitiated air and bodily defilement. The mind, almost of necessity, takes the same low, unhealthy tone. Self-respect is lost. A stupid, inert, languid feeling overpowers the system. The character becomes depraved, and too often, eager to snatch even a momentary enjoyment, to feel the blood bounding in the veins, the miserable victim flies to the demon of strong drink for relief. Hence misery, infamy, shame, crime, and wretchedness. This neglect of the conditions of daily health is a frightfully costly thing. It costs the rich a great deal of money in the shape of poor rates for the support of widows made husbandless and children made fatherless by typhus. It costs them also a great deal in disease, For the fever often spreads from the dwellings of the poor into the homes of the rich, and carries away father, mother, or children. It costs a great deal in subscription to maintain dispensaries, infirmaries, houses of recovery, and asylums for the destitutes. It costs the poor still more. It costs them their health, which is their only capital. In this is invested their all. If they lose it, their docket is struck, and they are bankrupt. How frightful is the neglect, whether it be on the part of society or of individuals, which robs the poor man of his health and makes his life a daily death. Why, then, is not sanitary science universally adopted and enforced? We fear it is mainly through indifference and laziness. The local authorities, municipalities and boards of guardians are so many Mrs. McLartys in their way. Like that dirty matron, they cannot be fashed. To remove the materials of disease requires industry, constant attention, and, what is far more serious, increased rates. The foul interests hold their ground and bid defiance to the attacks made upon them. Things did very well, they say, in the good old times. Why should they not do so now? When typhus or cholera breaks out, they tell us that nobody is to blame. That terrible nobody! How much he has to answer for! More mischief is done by nobody than by all the world besides. Nobody adulterates our food. Nobody poisons us with bad drink. Nobody supplies us with foul water. Nobody spreads fever in blind alleys and unswept lanes. Nobody leaves towns undrained. Nobody fills jails, penitentiaries, and convict stations. Nobody makes poachers, thieves, and drunkards. Nobody has a theory too, a dreadful theory. It is embodied in 2 words, laissez-faire, let alone. When people are poisoned by plaster of Paris mixed with flour, let alone is the remedy. When cocculus indicus is used instead of hops, and men die prematurely, it is easy to say, nobody did it. Let those who can find out when they are cheated. Caveat emptor. When people live in foul dwellings, let them alone. Let wretchedness do its work. Do not interfere with death. It matters nothing to me, said a rich man, who heard of a poor woman and her sick child being driven forth from a town for begging. The workhouse authorities would have nothing to do with her and sent her away. But the poor woman went and sat down with her child at the rich man's door. The child died there. The contagion of typhus was wafted into the gilded saloon and the luxurious bedchamber, and the rich man's child fell a victim to the disease. But nobody has considerably less power in society than he once had, and our hope is that he may ultimately follow in the wake of old bogey and disappear altogether. Wherever there is suffering and social depression, we may depend upon it that somebody is to blame. The responsibility rests somewhere, and if we allow it to remain, it rests with us. We may not be able to cope with the evil as individuals single-handed, but it becomes us to unite and bring to bear upon the evil the joint moral power of society in the form of a law. A law is but the expression of a combined will, and it does that for society, which society, in its individual and separate action, cannot so well or efficiently do for itself. Laws may do too much. They may meddle with things which ought to be let alone, but the abuse of a thing is no proper argument against its use in cases where its employment is urgently called for. Mere improvement of towns, however, as respects drainage, sewerage, paving, water supply, and abolition of cellar dwellings, will effect comparatively little unless we can succeed in carrying the improvement further, namely, into the homes of the people themselves. A well-devised system of sanitary measures may ensure external cleanliness, may provide that the soil on which the streets of houses are built shall be relieved of all superfluous moisture, and that all animal and vegetable refuse shall be promptly removed, so that the air circulating through the streets and floating from them into the houses of the inhabitants shall not be laden with poisonous miasmata, the source of disease, suffering, and untimely death. Cellar dwellings may be prohibited, and certain regulations as to the buildings hereafter to be erected may also be enforced. But here municipal or parochial authority stops. It can go no further. It cannot penetrate into the home, and it is not necessary that it should do so. The individual efforts of the community themselves are therefore needed, and any legislative enactments which dispensed with these would probably be an evil. The government does not build the houses in which the people dwell. These are provided by employers and by capitalists, small and large. It is necessary, therefore, to enlist these interests in the cause of sanitary improvement in order to ensure success. Individual capitalists have already done much to provide wholesome houses for their working people, and have found their account in so doing by their increased health, as well as in their moral improvement in all ways. Capitalists imbued with a benevolent and philanthropic spirit can thus spread blessings far and wide, and were a few enterprising builders in every town to take up this question practically and provide a class of houses for work people with suitable accommodation, provided with arrangements for ventilation, cleanliness, and separation of the sexes, such as health and comfort require, they would really be conferring an amount of benefit on the community at large, and at the same time, we believe, upon themselves, which it would not be easy to overestimate. But there also needs the active cooperation of the dwellers in poor men's homes themselves. They, too, must join cordially in the sanitary movement, otherwise comparatively little good can be effected. You may provide an efficient water supply, yet if the housewife will not use the water as it ought to be used, if she be lazy and dirty, the house will be foul and comfortless still. You may provide for ventilation, yet if offensive matters be not removed, and doors and windows are kept closed, the pure outer air will be excluded, and the house will still smell fusty and unwholesome. In any case, there must be a cleanly woman to superintend the affairs of the house, and she cannot be made so by Act of Parliament. The sanitary commissioners cannot, by any notification, convert the slatternly shrew into a tidy housewife, nor the disorderly drunkard into an industrious, home-loving husband. There must, therefore, be individual effort on the part of the housewife in every working man's home. As a recent writer on home reform observes, we must begin by insisting that, however much of the physical and moral evils of the working classes may be justly attributable to their dwellings, it is too often the case that more ought, in truth, to be attributed to themselves. For surely the inmate depends less on the house than the house on the inmate, as mind has more power over matter than matter over mind. Let a dwelling be ever so poor and incommodious, yet a family with decent and cleanly habits will contrive to make the best of it, and will take care that there shall be nothing offensive in it which they have power to remove. Whereas a model house, fitted up with every convenience and comfort which modern science can supply, will, if occupied by persons of intemperate and uncleanly habits, speedily become a disgrace and a nuisance. A sober, industrious, and cleanly couple will impart an air of decency and respectability to the poorest dwelling, while the spendthrift, the drunkard, or the gambler will convert a palace into a scene of discomfort and disgust. Since, therefore, so much depends on the character and conduct of the parties themselves, it is right that they should feel their responsibility in this matter, and that they should know and attend to the various points connected with the improvement of their own homes. While this important truth should be kept steadily in view, every possible exertion ought, at the same time, to be made to provide a greater abundance of comfortable, decent, and comely dwellings for the working classes. For it is to be lamented that, in many districts, they are, as it were, forced by the necessities of their condition to gravitate into localities and to inhabit dwellings where decency is rendered almost impossible, where life becomes a slow dying, and where the influences operating on the entire human energies, physical and moral, are of the most deleterious character. End of section 27.